Good evening, everybody. I am Tanmoy Mandal, the head of marketing of MSN Laboratory. I welcome, on behalf of MSN Lab, all the master faculties and guests for today's live program on management of pulmonary fibrosis and cytokine production in COVID-19 patient. Before I go for today's program, I'd like to introduce the MSN first. Innovation resonates a sense of purpose in the evolution and existing of human life. The creative capacity of a human mind has always been a source of inspiration. We believe every life matters and everyone deserves quality medicine. Apart from the efficacy, affordability, and accessibility, we want to be the first to touch and impact human life. We are MSN. MSN, Research for Better Medicine. The quest for innovation drives us to serve better and better today and tomorrow. MSN Research for Better Medicine. We have one of the Asia's largest integrated pharmaceutical API and formulation R&D center at Hyderabad. Meet the global Indian pharmaceutical company. Our global presence, turnover crossing 600 million USD, presence in 65 countries globally, and 8 offices worldwide, including US and UK. 11,000 workforce globally, own the trust of more than 4 crore customers across 65 countries. We have an integrated state-of-art R&D centers and 14 manufacturing facilities in India and USA, making Tricolor proud. Research for Better Medicine. Indian spirit, making Tricolor proud. MSN has 250 plus products in pipeline, 600 patents globally, 715 world largest DMF in US, 14 dossiers submitted in US, Canada and Australia, 100 plus ANDAs submitted in US, 25 products approved in US, 20 plus product tentative approval pending in US, 17 product commercialized in US. MSN first time India launches in that in 2013 we have started with Prasugrel, Fabustrate, Tapentadol, and we are only the company that brought the concept of tolvaptan in India. 2015 we have come to the Bosentan, Roflumilast, and Velaziridan. And 2016 we have brought Loracidon. 2017, we have come with the Ambrisentan, Cellulosine, Azilsartan, Mirabegron, Mesitantan, and Riociguat. And 2020, we have brought Trentine. Now, in 2020-21, we have come with the Dapa-1, Sacutan, the brand of Dapagliflozin, and Sacutan is Sacubitril Valsartan, Tofadose, and Vivanext. Partner in practice, MSN expertise of research and innovate brought first time India launches to support super specialists to bringing down the Indian patient suffering. To better stand by you, a company with global research, global manufacturing, and global quality. Company which has acquired trust globally. We at MSN on a journey to serve you better and better.
After 8:30.
To partner in creating awareness in management of pulmonary fibrosis and cytokine production in COVID-19 patient, approach for the emerging treatment option that to increase the patient life expectancy and quality of life. So before we start the today's program, I like to welcome today's moderator, Dr. Artika Das. Madam is a consultant pulmonologist, allergologist, and bronchoscopic HOD R&T Hospital, Kolkata. Madam, Dr. Artika Das completed MD in Mumbai in respiratory medicine and the tuberculosis and did fellowship in American College of Chest Physician. Madam presently working as a HOD in R&T International Institute in Kolkata. She was consultant pulmonologist at KPC Medical College, Kolkata. She has presented various papers at national and international forum. She is an expert in fiber optic bronchoscopy, both for diagnostic and therapeutic purpose. She conducted various drug trials in a large reference center in Mumbai. She has specialized in large spirometry like iOS and CPET in conduct polyisometry in both neurological and sleep disorder. So, madam, I like to over the session to you. Welcome, madam.
Thank you, Mr. Tanmoy Mandal, for your kind introduction. And good evening, ladies and gentlemen. These days, we are actually oversaturated with inputs for treatment of COVID patients. And we are equally extensively busy with treating these patients. However, my experience of treating COVID patients this year and last year has revealed there's a vast difference between presentation, treatment, and prognosis of patients affected by the coronavirus. Like me, many of you have certain confusing thoughts regarding this current topic. So, today it gives me great pleasure to chair a session on managing COVID emergencies and complications. You will be pleasantly surprised to listen to the luminaries on the panel. So, without me talking any further, let's proceed. Off we go. The first speaker for the evening is Dr. S.A. Rafi. And he is going to speak on managing pulmonary fibrosis post-COVID treatment. He is a senior consultant pulmonologist of CARE Hospital in Hyderabad, and he is an expert in interventional pulmonology, something which is close to me also. He is going to enlighten us on pulmonary fibrosis, a troublesome sequel of COVID pneumonia. Dr. Rafi, please, you've got 15 minutes on hand. You're welcome on board. I think Dr. Rafi needs to unmute himself.
Good evening, everyone.
Yeah, right.
Thank you for the kind introduction, Dr. Aritrika Das ji, and I've seen the other panelists and speakers also here. And good evening, everyone. And also I thank Ms. to invite me as a speaker on this panel. I think the task given to me in about next, I think 15 minutes, they said, I think we ran through 1 minute introducing myself as well. So quickly, I'll share my screen. So the topic we are going to speak today is about post-COVID fibrosis. I mean, not a lot of drugs actually there to actually, to treat pulmonary fibrosis as such, even before the COVID era. I think we have interstitial lung disease, which is usually takes only, with battling between a couple of drugs only. So when we see that, actually we had like about pirfenidone, we have heard it a few many years, like being used in idiopathic pulmonary fibrosis, shown to be showing some response. So this fibrosis, what we are seeing this time, is post-infectious fibrosis. We do have like earlier fibrosis, which are like drug-induced fibrosis, like you have anti-cancer drugs like bleomycin and so on and so forth, other ones. And we have seen that those fibrosis is little different than when you see a straight virus causing some damage to the lung. It has a little bit, I mean, as I ran through this presentation, I'm thinking that there would be only 4 or 5 real pointers. Probably a fellow clinician can pick it up. So that's what probably is the summation what we can look at. SARS-CoV-2 has created one of the most massive pandemics in the modern history, with lung fibrosis, an emerging complication of the SARS-CoV-2 infection. A brief insight on pulmonary fibrosis, as we see, nearly about like there is relentless, pretty much 1.5 years. We have been through nearly 14 to 15 months since the outbreak of the COVID-19 cases in India. There has been no stop. And then now we are like, world's hotspot in the pandemic with the second wave, which is hitting us hard. So it is that much more important that we need to know about this fibrosis and post sequelae, how you're going to manage it. So when you look into this, only when we look into this slide, I wanted to find out like only 5% severe to critical symptom patients out of 100 COVID positive patients. You say like only the 5% of the patients possibility that they would develop a fibrosis. Out of them, if you see like almost 50% will recover well. Out of the 5% to 7, I mean, because this pandemic, I would say it has touched 10% critical patients. at least 10% in this wave, you would say out of the 10% cases, like 20% go, obviously we're seeing they are now culminating into a death, and only about rest of the 80%. So only about 8% of the cases probably we can think of going into fibrosis. But initially when it started in Italy, when they observed, like in the first week itself, there are like almost 13% of the cases going into the fibrosis, end of the first week of hospital admissions. So that kind of scenario, they forecasted very early in the first wave in Italian physicians when they said, I think one of the articles we not included, but they said there as an anecdotally, look at this slide, like 81% of the patients with COVID-19 will be mild, 14% are in the distress and hypoxemia, 5% develop the respiratory failure. So what we are seeing now, there is an overlap. Who gets a fibrosis? They looks like a very stable patient. Even the fibrosis is encroaching into the patients who are even in that 81% patients also. Like younger patients, especially who are there, I mean, they're holding their symptoms, and then they are like not even coming to the hospital. They're managing by themselves because everybody is a clinician now, and he knows his prescription, what needs to be taken for the COVID. So I think he manages, and then he skips in certain things, and then what happens is late, he's coming to the hospital. This is happening. By then you see in the CT, there is fibrosis also, even in the stable looking patients. Long haulers is another word we have seen post fibrosis. Increasing number of patients worldwide who have survived COVID-19 continue to battle the symptoms of the illness long after they have been clinically tested negative for the disease. They are called long haulers. Various studies have reported that about 70 to 80% of these patients, that means who are recovered, out of 70 to 80% of the recovered patients also, at least one or more symptoms they have been complaining. Like you see, most women, they are saying more of palpitations. Men, they are saying a little bit of chest tightness. These kind of little things. Usually kids or younger generation, they said like recurrent headaches. They said that mild headaches are there. These kind of simple symptoms are there. Some people have these simple symptoms. So when you say chest tightness, probably in the long haulers, you need to think about there is still persisting some amount of stiffness in the lung, or in per se some fibrosis still there or not. Probably they are the ones who needs to be repeated as CT. Let's see, one of these patients, what we are seeing, one second. Yeah. So one of the complications of the COVID-19, as we are seeing, is mortality is substantial. More than 33% recovered patients develop fibrotic abnormalities. I think it is the same point which is making, but I think take home from this slide is about 33% are actually having some amount of fibrosis. I mean, they are recovering faster with the intervention. Without the intervention of any antifibrotic drug, have to be looked at as a data. Fatal cases of COVID-19 are also having some amount of diffuse alveolar damage, is a pathological hallmark with the pulmonary fibrosis of varying severity, has been mentioned. So what here mentioned is, and everybody on the consensus is about as early as 3 weeks after onset of symptoms, usually patients are developing some amount of fibrotic infection. So first 3 weeks, by end of the infection, almost by 3 weeks, they say that they should be overcoming the infection, but I think that is when you will be usually seeing some amount of fibrosis. When you look at the risk factors for pulmonary fibrosis, advanced age, severity of the illness, male gender per se, as I said, like usually they are the ones in the long haulers who say that there is a lot of chest tightness, comorbidities, hypertension, diabetes, length of ICU stay, mechanical ventilation, chronic alcoholism, and smoking. Smoking, if you go back, you know it, for the pulmonary fibrosis patients, they do have a smoking history as well. So here, even in the post-COVID fibrosis, even probably smoking also a contributing factor. It has to be linked more deeply at the association as well. So when you look at the pathogenesis here, actually it is dependent on binding to the angiotensin converting enzyme, which is a part of the renin-angiotensin system. Downregulation of angiotensin converting enzyme 2 upon virus binding disrupts the downstream activities of the RAS, resulting in increased inflammation and development of the fibrosis. So lasting respiratory symptoms, which include cytokine storm, edema formation, fibrosis development, sequentially has been mentioned in that. So when you, I mean, this is a busy slide. I don't think we are able to see the form here. I think mechanism of pulmonary fibrosis in COVID-19 in different form, that the IPF, other fibrotic lung disease, especially with the pathological findings pointing into alveolar epithelial cell being the site of the injury, not the endothelial cells. So just the point what from this slide has to be taken. I think we can always go back and then read in the books, because alveolar epithelial cells are being the site of the injury in the infectious fibrosis, whereas idiopathic, it is the endothelial cells. Okay. So let's look at the radiological findings in the pulmonary fibrosis in COVID-19 patients. When you look at the radiological imaging findings, CT chest usually in the coronal, and then these two sections which we are showing here, there is an extensive diffuse bilateral pulmonary ground glass opacities and airspace disease with architectural distortion, bronchiectasis. This is early to catch. When you see this, I mean, architectural distortion with the bronchiectasis, I think obviously there is a definite severe fibrosis in line for, to cause them a little bit of a reversibility needed. And they are taking about a long time. But even in the experience like 10 years back, when SARS has come, also they are seeing this kind of fibrosis, but I think it took a little longer time, and more amount of people are actually getting a fibrosis even in this time with the SARS-CoV. So this is an extensive diffuse bilateral pulmonary ground glass opacities with airspace disease with architectural distortion. I think similar point has been made here. So sequential of events, interstitial thickening, air bronchogram, irregular interface, coarse reticular pattern, parenchymal bands, pleural effusion is a late symptom. I would say usually not a lot of pleural effusion with the COVID infections. Some of the case reports also have been mentioned. Wakamori et al. In 2020, they said like CT scan revealed consolidation accompanied by reversed halo, sign, traction bronchiectasis, and volume loss. CT scan demonstrated bilateral consolidation, some of which showed the band-like shapes. Everybody has mentioned about band-like shapes in their observational studies. Subpleural and peribronchial region traction bronchiectasis has been mentioned. In another study also, histology, lung alveoli in the explanted lung. I said alveoli is the place, not the endothelial cells. Bronchiolitis and bronchial have fibrosis with the microscopic honeycombing was also observed, especially who are hypertensive as well. Some of the other mentioned similar changes in their studies. I think this just for the sake of putting it here, we kept it, but I think pretty much similar features what you see in the fibrosis: septal thickening, interlobular septal thickening, bronchiectasis, traction bronchiectasis, consolidation, and plate-like interlobe, architectural distortion are all seen in everywhere. Distortion, diagnosis of fibrotic lung disease per se in the COVID-19 modified approach, I think it is not about diagnosis here, about the fibrotic lung. We see usually with the initial evaluation, CTD serology, chest HRCT, everybody knows as a pulmonologist, I would say here, and then how to approach a fibrotic lung workup. So patients suspected to have ILD, we would go for a detailed history. Like a lot of times we need to go back and then look at the history that whether really it is a fibrosis or any other thing. So physical examination, CTD serology is a very integral part, because almost 1/3 of the all ILDs are CTD connected, CTD ILDs. I think my fellow speaker probably is jumping in later. I think he'll be an expert in these things to tell about, as a rheumatologist, how they are as well. Just a HRCT, PFT is there. PFT is also pulmonary function test. PFT includes PLCO. So I think it's a regular stream of things. And then we are moving from, surgical lung biopsy to only relying more on the MDD, and then the CT radiologist getting involved, and then pathologist getting involved. We are less and less doing a biopsy and then actually arriving at the diagnosis of the ILD. This everybody agrees upon it. So this is just a brief slide to say that management of pulmonary fibrosis following SARS-CoV infection. Looking at it, we're talking about when you look at the pulmonary fibrosis treatments, there are so many so many has been tried. Plasminogen activation, traditional Chinese medicine, Fusenguo is something like very, difficult to pronounce. Chinese medicine has been mentioned. Pirfenidone and nintedanib is being the mainstay. When you see there is some amount of spironolactone, mineralocorticoid receptor antagonistic activity. This also fibrotic change in the lung. So spironolactone has also been tried by some people and then seen some positive results. Hyperbaric oxygen, human amniotic fluid, and also antivirals anyway are there for the immediate infection control. There is no fully documented therapeutic method in the treatment of post-inflammatory pulmonary fibrosis after coronavirus infection. However, some have been considered. There is a therapeutic rationale for the use of licensed antifibrotic therapy in acute exacerbation of IPF, but I think we still to get for SARS-CoV, because that's why we are playing with the drugs, where only 2 drugs pretty much I can see in the past 1.5 year. Most of the clinicians have been trying and toiling with this pirfenidone and nintedanib, which is already established. The pirfenidone, nintedanib has been used a bit in the scleroderma and connective tissue disease related, some of the, but I think probably seems to be showing some promising result. But I think I am trying to stick to the pirfenidone in my talk today. Potential role of antifibrinolytic therapy is suggested based on circumstantial evidence and proposed similarity in the mechanism of post-COVID lung fibrosis is similar to idiopathic, but post-COVID, most inflammatory, post-infectious fibrosis have a relatively higher oxidative stress along with the inflammation, not just the pure oxidative stress, along with the inflammation, both as a combination stress causing the fibrosis. They have been mentioned ionizing radicals, NFPs, collagen, TGF, IL-6 rays. This is all detailed pathogenesis. I'm not going in here. So broadly to look at it, pirfenidone, which shows it could inhibit it shows the effective against the inflammation, fibrosis, and oxidation. Can attenuate the lung injury because of it reduces the LPS-induced acute lung injury and subsequent fibrosis. It also has a down-regulating effect on the cytokines and TGF-beta1, connective tissue growth factor, platelet-deriving growth factor, and TNF-alpha. In addition, as a scavenger of the reactive abscission species, it also downregulates the angiotensin-converting enzyme receptor expression. This is the one which we are pointing it out because of specifically SARS-CoV, one of the major receptors in COVID-19 pathogenesis. This also has an effect. That is where we are actually targeting with the pirfenidone, being one of the drug for the antifibrotic agent in the therapy. Dosing guidelines have also been there. It's also been established already. Caucasians typically able to tolerate 2400 mg over 24 hours, whereas in Indian population, what we have seen is they are not going beyond 1800 mg tolerability. At least 800 mg TID, they are able to tolerate. At the 600 mg TID, they are able to tolerate at the most, though actual suggested is about 2400 up to 2400 mg over 24 hours in 3 divided doses. So I would say that point. And then see, nintedanib is also an antifibrotic agent. Only a red dotted point I wanted to mention, because rampantly now all the clinicians have been prescribing nintedanib as a choice for an antifibrotic agent. So I would say when you're starting an antifibrotic agent during therapy, during the course of the recovery of the patient, you need to be careful, because there is an increased risk of bleeding, as most of the COVID-19 patients are in the anticoagulant with nintedanib. So this is the only point which we need to just pay attention. So probably you are very fond of amongst the two. You have a choice of favorite, but usually very early starting, I think you still need to rely on an established pirfenidone. So therapeutic benefits seems to be SpO2 during the 6-minute exercise test. Improvement is there, slow progression of the IPF, slow decline in the lung function, increasing 1 or 2 years survival, stabilizing lung function, all being established in that. So other treatments, what are the other treatments what we can look at? Steroids. If you see, steroids are being the mainstay. Recovery trial has been proved it. Just about recent, I think they have updated their recovery trials, more findings as well. Steroids are strongly as the mainstay in the recovery of the illness, I would say. For the pulmonary fibrosis, they do have some role. Rationale of using corticosteroids in viral pneumonia is to decrease host inflammatory response in the lungs. So although there is no reliable evidence of the efficacy of the corticosteroids treating pulmonary fibrosis following SARS-CoV, they are commonly used as an empirical therapy post-inflammatory pulmonary fibrosis still. But I think there, in the context of nowadays treatment, rampantly using a long-standing steroid has to be avoided. But I think I would definitely stop once the patient recovers from the post-COVID treating the fibrosis with the steroid. I would definitely back off. Why? Because we don't want, you're seeing a lot of black fungus kind of mentioning in the news, and then the ENT surgeons, neurologists in their ICUs are filled with more Mucor cases and diabetes. So these are coexisting conditions which actually are deterrent to treat the pulmonary fibrosis, post-COVID inflammatory pulmonary fibrosis, not to extend post-beyond therapy of recovery with this steroid. Spironolactone, very interesting. Aldosterone, which is an adrenocortical hormone, physiological mineralocortical increase of the extracellular matrix turnover, which is observed in the pulmonary fibrosis, exerts its effect primarily on the lung epithelium. There are no direct studies that actually present the beneficial effects. Mineralocorticoid receptor antagonist post-viral fibrosis, but could be a potential treatment. So I think there is going to be cardiologists want to jump in and do more research, and nephrologists want to jump in and do more research, probably in this direction, and then want to take their pie out of the COVID treatment and the pulmonary fibrosis as well. As a pulmonologist, probably have to watch for it. So other tissue plasminogen activator, same thing goes for this as well, because they are on the anticoagulants in the initial 3 weeks. Patients, it is to remember thrombocytopenia may occur in patients with COVID-19, which reduces the possibility of using this therapy. So whoever on the antithrombotic therapy or preventive, anticoagulant therapy in the COVID, exclusive COVID treatment, not for the fibrosis, that point of time, tissue plasminogen activator is a definite no-no. But I think at the same time, there seems to be some amount of benefit. It can be used for the pulmonary fibrosis. I don't think we've been using it, but this has to be looked at in scenarios. No further mechanical ventilation is possible. And then it is usually dependent, on is patients who are candidates for the TPA treatment, or especially in the environments where ECMO is not widely available, and sick patients. And this is, I think, little bit of a offshoot where very less patients we have used in our care hospital also.
Dr. Rafi,
so other treatment options for pulmonary fibrosis. Okay, I am done. Just give me about a minute. So other treatment options to look at it, I think antibiotic is also mentioned. I just wanted to point out teicoplanin is also one antibiotic you want to prescribe to prevent fibrosis, probably teicoplanin. But you all know what is it for? Gram-positive organisms. Of course, like prolonged ICU stay, gram-positive organisms. I don't want to read through this. Then I think it's a busy slide. I'll skip it. Strategies to take home message. Pretty much considering huge numbers of individuals affected by the COVID-19, even rare complications like post-COVID pulmonary fibrosis, major health impacts. And then in the population level, not just the pulmonologist, I think there are a lot of people in the other specialists looking at the scooping out chunk where they would be intervening about treating this patient. Like, as I said, aldosterone, and as I said, cardiologists and pulmonologists, anyway, they're bread and butter here. Elderly patient who require ICU care, mechanical ventilation are the highest risk of developing lung fibrosis. Pirfenidone could inhibit the apoptosis, downregulates the ACE receptor expression, decreases inflammation. Several mechanisms ameliorate the oxidative stress, and then in turn, pneumocytes on the alveolar layer, alveolar epithelial cells, rather than the endothelial cells in this process from preventing the fibrosis. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Rafi. I hated to tell you to wind up because it was very interesting. But then we have other speakers in queue, and we go on to the next topic, right? The next speaker for this evening is Dr. Suprat Arya. He is a reputed consultant rheumatologist and immunologist at JP Hospital, Noida, and he'll throw light on management of cytokine storm. We welcome you, sir, on this dais, and your time starts now. We have to stick to the timing because because we have lots to discuss on this.
Sure.
Thank you very much.
Okay. Okay, I think my slides are visible, so I'll just start. So I am going to discuss about managing cytokine storm in COVID-19, particularly discussing the newer molecules which have been recently been used. Steroids, as Dr. Rafi has already mentioned, they are being used right and left for COVID management. So I'm just going to focus about JAK inhibitors, and specifically tofacitinib, which is one of the JAK inhibitor which is easily available in India. So the flow will be, I'll talk about briefly about COVID-19 phases, cytokine storm, how it presents, how to diagnose it, and what is the evidence of treatment of cytokine storm with JAK inhibitors, and what is the status of tofacitinib in the management paradigm. So I'll just briefly go through this. Dr. Rafi has already covered this. Most of the patients will have mild flu-like symptoms and recover. Around 15% or maybe lesser will have the pulmonary phase. And we are seeing more and more number of patients who will have a hyperinflammatory response, having a mortality up to 50%. So this is the phase which we want to totally avoid by treating the cytokine storm in its early phase. So why does cytokine storm occur? So if you compare these two graphs, you will understand that what is the difference between a person with a mild disease and a person with a severe disease. If you see here, as soon as the viral load starts to rise, body mounts a very good type 1 interferon response, which is an antiviral response. And as the type 1 interferon response goes up, the viral replication comes down, and the immune response in the gray, which is showing here, it was starting to mount, but as the viral load has gone down, it also starts to come down. And the lymphocytes, the B cell and the T cells, they give us the long-term immunity in the form of antibodies, and the T cells, which will give cell-mediated immunity. In a person who is unable to mount a good type 1 interferon response, the viral load will keep on increasing. There will be viral replication because the viral replication is going unchecked. So the inflammatory response will go up. But as viral load is very high, the cells will keep on getting stimulated. And to control that viral replication, the inflammatory cytokine secretion and the number of cells getting informed in the inflammatory cascade will keep on increasing. The virus will go away eventually, but the inflammation has gone into an auto drive mode, and the vicious cycle goes on, and it leads on to cytokine storm, which is the common terminal event in most of the COVID-19 patients. So what is exactly happening in the at the molecular level? Dr. Rafi has beautifully described that the coronavirus attaches to the ACE2 receptor on the epithelial cells in the alveolum, and then it replicates inside the cell and comes out from extruding out of the cell. So the type 1 interferon response can control the viral replication, and if this is curbed, probably the cytokine storm won't occur. Very interestingly, the data exists that the young male patients who have cytokine storm, they have innate defect in type 1 interferon response. They have a genetic defect in type 1 interferon, which predisposes them to have very high viral load and which causes cytokine storm. And in elderly, we have data that those elderly who have antibodies against type 1 interferons, even them, they will have a blunted response of type 1 interferon, and this viral replication will go unchecked. So once the viral replication is unchecked, innate cells will get stimulated, dendritic cells, monocytes, macrophages, and these stimulated cells will start secreting more and more cytokines, pro-IL beta, TNF alpha, IL-6, and whole lot of chemokines, CXCL1, CLCN, etc. And this will recruit further more inflammatory cells, and these inflammatory cells will go into a vicious cycle. This leads on to endothelial injury, vascular leakage happening all over the systemic circulation, leading to ARDS in the lungs, myocarditis, and multiple organ dysfunction. So this is the terminal event with cytokine storm which happens. So there is no clear-cut definition, but cytokine storm is defined as an umbrella term which encompasses several disorders of immune dysregulation characterized by constitutional symptoms, systemic inflammation, and multi-organ dysfunction, and it can lead to multi-organ failure if untreated. So this is a very important cartoon you can see from a very beautiful review article in NEGM December 2020. If you go through in detail, you will find out lot of these are very non-specific. You can see them in otherwise sick patients also in ICU. So cytokine storm is not very easy to pick in the early stages when multi-organ dysfunction has not started. For example, fever, anorexia, fatigue can be there, CNS dysfunction. In fact, every organ can get affected with cytokine storm. And this, when goes on relentlessly, will lead on to or multi-organ failure. So they have also defined the criteria to diagnose cytokine storm. Elevated circulating cytokine levels. Here I would like to say we should not run after IL-6 because a lot of patients are even themselves getting checked for IL-6. CRP is a very good surrogate marker of IL-6 and IL-6 is expensive. So CRP is good enough. Ferritin is very good surrogate marker of IL-18. So even testing individual cytokines is not very feasible economically as well. So the CRP and ferritin will give us a good idea of that. Acute systemic inflammatory symptoms, which we have just discussed. And when the secondary organ dysfunction sets in, then we can say the cytokine storm is there. Another important pointer can be that once we start therapy with neutralization of cytokine or anti-inflammatory agents, there may be improvement, giving us a clue that probably the therapy that we are giving for cytokine storm is responding. However, it is not necessarily that the therapy given to for the cytokine storm will actually make it better, because there is, as you saw on the timeline, there are various molecules which play a role at different points of time. So everybody with cytokine storm may not respond to the standard of care therapy. So the hyper inflammatory response can rapidly progress, may increase the risk of death. So we have to find out strategy to deal with this hyperactive immune response to control the multi-organ failure. We all know steroids have been used. There is no doubt one molecule which has proven in every trial, every data, that steroids are beneficial. But as Dr. Rafi mentioned, right and left using steroid has causing other kinds of problem. Uncontrolled diabetes, having infections, getting ICU acquired pneumonias, and then the mucor, which is coming up in huge number of cases recently. So I have put up this here again just to show you what are the various areas where we can block this cytokine storm. So in the in the extracellular fluid, we have all these inflammatory cytokines like IL-18, TNF-alpha, IL-6. So tocilizumab being used here is to block the IL-6. Siltuximab is used in US and UK, which is not available in India. Anakinra also, unfortunately, is not available in India. It specifically blocks IL-1 beta. Infliximab and other TNF-alpha blockers are being used a lot because of the lack of availability of tocilizumab because of its excessive usage. So TNF-alpha blockers are being used. This is happening in the extracellular fluid. But once these cytokines attach to the cell membrane, they start an inflammatory cascade inside the cell. They stimulate NF-kappa beta, which can be tackled by corticosteroids. And this is the one which I'm going to focus today. That is the JAK-STAT pathway, in which the JAK inhibitors can play a significant role. If we let this inflammatory cascade go unchecked, it will lead on to multi-organ failure and death. So we have to intervene somewhere here in between before it is too late. So briefly, I'll tell you what is JAK-STAT pathway and how do we inhibit it. So JAK-STAT pathway is basically the common pathway of action of multiple cytokines of body. This is just an example slide. A cytokine attaches to its dimeric receptor on the surface of the cell membrane. There are two JAKs which are attached to the intracellular domains, which phosphorylate this STAT. And this STAT gets dimerized, moves inside the nucleus, and then it leads on to transcription of various cytokines. So a cytokine itself can increase the production of other cytokines. This is how amplification pathway goes unchecked, because once there is cytokine storm, it is not going to stop. So sorry for the busy slide. I have just put in here to show you that whole lot of cytokines, which I mentioned on the top here, work through these pathways. And there are 4 kinds of JAKs: JAK1, JAK2, JAK3, and TYK2. And there are 6 types of stats: STAT1, STAT2, STAT3, STAT4, STAT5, STAT6. So you can see all kind of cytokines, interferons, and your chemokines are working through these pathways. So what kind of JAK inhibitors are available which can block these? So in our country currently, we have these 2 molecules which are available. Tofacitinib is JAK1 and JAK3 inhibitor with some inhibition of JAK2, and baricitinib is JAK1 and JAK2 inhibitor. Both of these are approved for treatment of rheumatoid arthritis, and tofacitinib is also approved for treatment of polyarticular juvenile idiopathic arthritis and psoriatic arthritis and ulcerative colitis. So now let's see what evidence we have. This baricitinib plus remdesivir, a recent trial has come, which is a double-blind, multi-center randomized control trial, and it has shown that baricitinib, along with combination of remdesivir, has shown significant improvement in the time to recovery and the time to recovery patient receiving oxygen or non-invasive ventilation. Adverse effects were less, and the most important, which they have not mentioned in this visual abstract, which was published a few months back, is that there is decreased mortality. The baricitinib remdesivir had mortality of around 5%, and placebo remdesivir had mortality of around 7.8%, which was a significant difference. So coming to the focus of today's talk, which is tofacitinib. Tofacitinib, I have already mentioned, it is a JAK inhibitor with predominant JAK1 and JAK3 inhibitory action, and it is approved for so many autoimmune conditions and rheumatoid arthritis. So once we inhibit the JAK-STAT pathway by tofacitinib, we can block the amplification pathway of these chemokines, of which IL-6 is very important. That is why the tocilizumab came in to block this cytokine storm. Steroids have been come. Now an oral agent which can block this cytokine storm has a very shorter half-life. It's definitely can be a very good preferable option. So this is what they have given in the reason, that there are many cytokines involved. Rather than targeting just one IL-6 by monoclonal antibody tocilizumab or anakinra, which is unfortunately not available here, tofacitinib can take control of more cytokines than tocilizumab alone. So what evidence we have for tofacitinib? So this is a review article in which they have done a research of 733 studies, in which they included 4 randomized and 11 non-randomized trials. And they showed that JAK inhibitors have definitely shown there is decreased mortality, there is decreased ICU admission, and there is early discharge of the patients who were treated with JAK inhibitors as compared to standard of care. So there is decreased odds of mortality, decreased odds of ICU admission, and increased odds of hospital discharge earlier as compared to standard of care. Another retrospective data of around 269 patients who had COVID pneumonia, they were divided in 2 groups, in which one group was treated with tofacitinib plus standard of care, and other received dexamethasone plus minus tocilizumab. Even in this group, they showed that there was 70% reduction in odds of dying among the patients of tofacitinib as compared to the dexamethasone group. Why it is better tolerable? I would say 8 milligram per kg tocilizumab has a half-life of around 42 days. It will block the receptors for 42 days, while tofacitinib has half-life of only 3 to 6 hours. So if a patient in ICU is being treated for cytokine storm and also develop sepsis, once tocilizumab has been given, it will have a very prolonged action. On the other hand, we have a drug which has very shorter half-life and is orally available, and we can withdraw it, and the effect of drug will also be taken away quickly. Other benefit as compared to steroid is lack of hyperglycemia, and there is no metabolic side effects like electrolyte disturbances, fluid retention. If a patient has cardiac dysfunction, myocarditis, giving high dose steroids can become a problem in a critically ill patient. So there are a lot of ongoing trials of tofacitinib. Some of them are multi-center randomized double-blind placebo-controlled trial, and probably will be getting their results in few weeks or few months. And there are multiple other trials in which this JAK inhibitor is being tried. Baricitinib has definitely shown, and it has gotten emergency approval by US for the management of cytokine storm. And so this tofacitinib may also get it once these trials are going to show improved outcomes. So to summarize, it will reduce inflammation and inflammatory pathologies. It is a broad spectrum. It is not a targeted therapy. There is the evidence, it is improving, and lot of data and lot of studies are already going on. There is definite survival benefit, and it has not got the metabolic adverse events like we have with steroids. And it has a very shorter half-life also. So with this, I conclude. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Arya, for your excellent talk and also an excellent time management procedure. Well, after these two enlightening talks, we'd like to have maybe 2 minutes of a session with our Emerson Medical Director. And after that, we go on to the panel discussion.
Yeah. My slides is visible?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yep.
When everybody is feeling the crisis that metro cities are facing the shortage of the medicine in the COVID-19 and amid the surge in the cases, the antiviral drug like remdesivir, favipiravir, and all are getting the shortage. The demand was in rise. The panic buying case by using the favipiravir shortage. So all the products were out of stock. MSN was the company that was addressing the shortage of the COVID flu medicine that time. So based on that, MSN taken a lead and made all his COVID flu medicine available in all e-pharmacies like Fabilo, Tofados, that the tofacitinib sir was talking now. So all the medicines are available in all the e-pharmacies, major e-pharmacies in India. COVID support medicine also, that is a brand like Palmofib for the Pirfenidone 267-801 and the Davifib for the prevention of stroke and systemic embolism, Dabigatran Elixirate, that is 75, 110 and 150 mg also, it is also made available. The future advanced molecule to battle against COVID-19, MSN has planned the Baridose, the baricitinib that sir was talking, that is a selective genus kinase inhibitor. USFDA issues an emergency use of authorization. That molecule is also coming soon to the market. Not only that, Molulo, that is a molnupiravir tablet, the rapid action within 24 hours. There is a newer antiviral drug and complete suppression. That is also coming soon to the market now. Avilo, that is abitable injection also, that is synthetic vasoactive intestine peptide. USFDA granted the abitadil for the treatment of respiratory disease in COVID-19. That is also coming soon to the market. Together we can fight the COVID-19. MSN, the Research for Better Medicine, the brands that we have for the COVID management, that is Fabilo, Tofados, Palmofib, and Davifib. So, ma'am, thank you, ma'am.
Thank you, Mr. Mondal. You're showing us the light. Let's see how far the light goes and how soon the light comes on.
Yes, ma'am.
We are going on to the panel discussion. We have got two senior panelists on board. Dr. Banani Jana, who is HOD Pulmonary Medicine at IMS and SUM Hospital, Bhubaneswar. Welcome, Dr. Banani Jana. And Dr. Sandeep Kharkar, he is a rheumatology specialist from Nagpur. And welcome on board, Dr. Sandeep too. And both of you were highly experienced persons in your fields. So, Dr. Banani, could you please share with us some of your experience on management of COVID pneumonias?
Hello, madam. What can I say in this pandemic? And it is super saturated, as you have already said. And we are the manager of the largest COVID hospital in Odisha. And it was established just 1.5 years back. Still we are battling with COVID, the second wave. Still we are having more than 10,000 cases and about 20 deaths per day. And more and more ICU admission and HDU admission. Oxygen requirement is more, oxygen beds needed more. So this is the situation in Odisha. in all our whole country. So in COVID, we have already tried with Perfenadone in last year and in this year also. We have got good result, but I don't know what will be the long term, because without Perfenadone also some people they recover. But with Perfenadone, I have observed that oxygen requirement of the patient suddenly goes down, and patient spared from the long-term use of steroids. And just recently, we have started with Baricitinib in moderate COVID disease, who have sudden increase in requirement of oxygen or impending cytokine storm, not going for few days, for last 1 week or 10 days, Baricitinib had started in our COVID hospital. So about the result, we have to wait a little more for the result to see whether it is working or not working.
Ma'am, one question is,
Yes, ma'am.
when exactly do you start Perfenadone in the course of your treatment?
Actually, when the patients came out of ICU and the oxygen requirement increases, and the steroid has been used for more than 2 to 3 weeks, then we started giving when there is total lung fibrosis or more than 70%
Basically
of the lung.
post-COVID.
Yes, ma'am. Post-COVID, after RT-PCR negative, we do it for the come to the ICU to segregate them to separate ICU, so that from COVID ICU take them out from another ICU. There we have tried with Perfenadone.
Thank you, Dr. Jena. Can I have Dr. Sandeep here, please? Please share your experience, whatever you've been having with COVID pneumonias. But at the same time, I'd like to know how frequently and what exactly the newer drugs you're using, and are they really helping you in recovery of the severe COVID pneumonias?
Yeah, thank you, madam, for this question. Actually, these new drugs are not newer for us. Infliximab, JAK inhibitors, all these are drugs which we are using day in, day out. Okay, na? The thing is only for COVID. Yeah, for trial basis and other things, it is newer for us also as it is for you. And as per Dr. Arya must be knowing also, we are using this JAK inhibitors and we are not getting that much of patients of COVID in rheumatological diseases. So maximum patients, they are on these drugs first and foremost. They are on immunomodulators, some are on steroids. So we are not getting lot many of rheumatological disease, cases which comes as a COVID positive, or either they are very bad in illness. So yeah, in cytokine storm, wherever we use in a flares like say SLE or RA, these drugs are very much of giving a good benefit of treatment. So in this, even in COVID also, when we are trying these drugs, infliximab or baricitinib or tofacitinib, tocilizumab, these are the drugs which gives a better result. But it should be started in a perfect time when it is required. That it should not be started at the day one also. It can't be started after viral load has come down or the patient is on ventilator. So they are useless when we use in later stages or very early stages. It should be used in a very perfect timings.
And what is the perfect timing?
Whenever the patient is going for hypoxia, like patient is going for SpO2 is going below 92, if patient is having fever, they are going into the cytokine storm, like CRP is increasing, ferritin is increasing. At that time, we have to interfere. Till then, we can't interfere. We can't just give this drug as an empirical line of management or totally blindly, because it may harm the patient. It has a double.
Basically, yes. So basically, when they are going on for hospitalization,
yeah,
when they're just stepping into the severe COVID group. Thank you very much, Dr. Sandeep.
Thank you.
And we had thought of like taking up some questions, because I can see a lot of our viewers have actually listened to such interesting topic, and this being our hot topic for the day. Now, but before I go on to those questions, I personally have one or two questions which may be of use to all of us. One is, you're saying pulmonary, this is a question for our first speaker, that you had said pulmonary fibrosis is seen in around 8% of the patients. Well, one is, I don't know, maybe I'm wrong also. Clinically or in practical life, we see many more cases of pulmonary fibrosis than 8%. And secondly, is there any way to prevent it, Dr. Rafi? Dr. Rafi, please.
So when I said like 8 to 10% are who are actually getting affected well by the severe to moderate to severe change, which can happen and then have a more sickness. Those are the patients are more, we have a pool of patients who are coming to the hospital have shown clearly fibrosis. Whereas but what we are seeing of late is the patients who look like very stable, because now what we are seeing is large chunk of population is already getting infected, who are recovering unknowingly, even by the simple prescriptions, but coming late to the OPDs also with chest tightness and then those kind of symptoms. So I think those pools also is there. We need to add who are silently getting fibrosed also. So basically, I would say, I think mentioned earlier about 70%, 70% change in the CT very early through the first week itself of the disease are a good indicator that 60 to 70% CT changes happening. And that means moderate and above. If it is happening, that means they are very, very well likely that they would get into the zone of a fibrosis patient. So I think to prevent them, I would in fact stick on saying that not wait for until patient becomes negative, recovers, moves from the ICU and then going to the non-COVID area and then starting antifibrotic. I think it makes sense adding an early antifibrotic. What we are doing, in fact, in the practice would actually make sense, because these drugs will take long time to actually make a change to prevent the fibrosis. We have seen this with experience with the IPRs. So it will take like 3 months to see some, progression has been halted a bit. So if that is the scenario, I think in this kind of infectious phases, we can try early also, provided other parameters, as I said, discussed, where, looking at it, their condition, and then can be gone for those drugs. So I think I would say if the 76 anywhere about moderate to above changes in the CT and the moderate to above changes in the CT, and then the sick patient admitted into the hospital or even in the OPD, walking in young patient, 70% of the change, I think he needs to be considering an early antifibrotic addition for the patient.
Is there any role of
so preventive, because you're asking about preventive.
Yes.
Not later not to go for the fibrosis. Yeah.
Is there any role of ACE inhibitor?
Pardon me?
Is there any role of ACE inhibitor in preventing fibrosis?
I mean, this has been shown to be showing regulation is one of the action of the pirfenidone has been noted. So I think that is what we are banking on for not to push it to going into the fibrosis. So, Dr. Banani has told, like we have seen, without even using also, a lot of patients improving, because that has been seen even in the SARS experience also a decade back, because that time I think not been used than antifibrotic in the SARS patients. So about all the patients which we have seen in Japan and that Hong Kong based patient pool, they have seen like over a period of 1 year, of the fibrosis shown patients. I mean, like there is only about a good few chunk, but they were not on any antifibrotic. They're shown, I think, at least 70 to 80% resolution in those patients by end of an year. We are not talking about the end of an year here. So post-infectious fibrosis usually resolve on their own also, but we are speeding it up a bit.
I was asking.
And then quality of life. And then she also added a good point, ma'am, that Dr. Banani has a good point that need of oxygenation goes down. So I think post-recovery patients, I would say who needs blindly putting an antifibrotic also, who can be stable sitting in a room without having an oxygen need, but a little movement his saturation dips post-recovered patient. So he's obviously a fibrosis patient. So a little bit of movement, like I think he cannot pee with a little bit of strain. His saturation dips, but sitting quietly idle, his saturations are okay.
Thank you. And
so from 92, Rumair, the moment he makes a little movement, it dips to the 82. I think those are the patients we need to look into it. There are definite changes in the CT, and then they need an antifibrotic.
Well, thank you very much. And one question for Dr. Arya: when exactly do we start tofacitinib?
Okay, so that is the probably the most important point. What I would say is we should not give any immunosuppressant in first week of the illness, and most of the patients will not develop hypoxia or complication during that particular time. I am not working in COVID ICU, being a rheumatologist, so I cannot tell you the first-hand experience. Probably my co-panelist and other people would have those kind of view that they see the patient daily. But I can tell you for sure, those patients who continue to have high spiking fever after 7 days, rapidly going up CRP and ferritin, their D-dimer also going up, showing a systemic inflammatory response going on, and then they start having hypoxia. Even with these, I think oral steroids can be the okay thing, because why to give a higher immunosuppression along with steroids? So we cannot just bombard them with immunosuppression, because COVID itself induces a kind of immune dysfunction which can predispose to infections. So those patients who, despite all this, continue to progress having hypoxia, like in the baricitinib trial also, they had taken patients who had CRP of more than 75 and whose SpO2 on room air was less than 92, like Dr. Rafi said. So 92 saturation less than and CRP going up. These are the patients. And obviously we should exclude secondary bacterial infections, because giving immunosuppression or increasing immunosuppression in such patients can be detrimental.
Dr. Banani, do you have anything to say on this?
Ma'am, I have a question. When see a procal before starting baritinib, actually we do it regularly, whether to exclude any secondary infection, because we are again, as Dr. Arya had said, we are bombarding with another immunosuppression, and post tocilizumab complication we have seen a lot. The reactivation of the tubercular focus and everything we have seen. And for that cavitary lesion, I have seen massive hemoptysis and patient succumbing for that. So we should better, the time is the $1 million question, as Dr. Arya told. It's very difficult, and the critical care medicine are working for that. The timing to give to start the baritinib, which is available now in market.
Thank you very much. Now on to some of the questions from the audience. Question to Dr. Rafi: how long should we prescribe antifibrotics in post-COVID patients? Can't hear you, Dr. Rafi. Can't hear you, Dr. Rafi. Will you please unmute yourself, or maybe can't hear you.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. So this is usually about anywhere between 3 months to 6 months, I would say, actually using an antifibrotic as the minimum in a post-infectious phase. With the experience, at least about 3 months to 6 months,
Absolutely.
Depending on the severity of the, about the patient's condition, because the severely affected probably would take about at least 6 months. Moderately affected patients, I want to put it broadly.
Okay.
Moderately affected patients about at least 3 months to see that as significant, some benefit with the drug along with the natural resolution. I'm saying It's a part of the team of recovery. Yeah.
Right. There was another question, like choice of antifibrotic. I think we've already discussed it in the presentation, right? Now, how can we manage the post-discharge thromboembolic episode in COVID patients, and what are the antithrombotic agents in choice? I think This has also been discussed. But anyway, any one of you would like to comment, please? Dr. Rafi, Dr. Banani.
Yes. So, yeah. I can tell, like, you usually, the cardiologist's favorite earlier has been a good one, which is rivaroxaban has been the better choice, which have been used on a super low dose. Yes. Thinking about a microvasculitis process keeps going on post recovery as well, up to 3 months. Yeah, up to 3 months. So,
is it to be given as a routine? I think yeah.
I think we should check the D-dimer in between. If it is more than 3 to 4 times, then we will continue it up to 3-4 months. So according to D-dimer, we should monitor the microvasculitis things of the COVID. Without D-dimer, I think we should not. We should monitor the D-dimer first, and we will give rivaroxaban or whatever things we should give. We will give with D-dimer.
So do we give it as a routine?
Yes, madam. I used to give it to 3 to 4 weeks, and in between I check a D-dimer. Then only I will reduce it, or I will increase the duration. That I will depends on the D-dimer.
At least about fortnight repeat of D-dimer is needed.
Yeah,
if you're given even for the 6 weeks.
Yes.
Yeah, and maybe one last question for the day is. We all know that steroids are the only drugs probably which have found a place in COVID treatment, right? Now, one question from our audience is how strongly we recommend immunomodulatories in place of steroids.
Immunomodulatory in place of steroids.
Place of steroids, Dr. Arya, Dr. Sandeep.
Okay, so I would say standard of care is to give steroids first.
Yes.
Dexamethasone orally, or there is not much of a difference if you use methylprednisolone or prednisolone also. Equivalent dose of that can be used. Or the trial had baricitinib along with steroids. And tocilizumab also is never given alone. It is only once the patient is on corticosteroids and then also not improving and going into cytokine storm, then we give the higher agent like tocilizumab or TNF alpha blockers. So I think that will remain the standard of care as first line.
Dr. Sandeep, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, steroid can be given at like if patient is a home quarantine and if patient is having some part of breathlessness and some 92 or 90% of hypoxia plus some chest pain or cough. So steroid can be started at home also. It can be given at home starting. If patient deteriorates, then he gets admitted, and after that, along with steroid, we add the immunomodulator. As a immunomodulators, it is not a first drug of choice, or it cannot be started as a first drug. So, and nowadays, it also has given the data that they should start inhaled steroids at 6th or 7th day if patient is having some part of hypoxia, like breathlessness and other things. So, steroid is the first line of management. After that, if patient deteriorates or if patient is not improving, then immunomodulators is the drug.
Thank you. All of you, medical director, from all of us. Yes, Mr. Mondal, would you? Yes.
Yeah, ma'am. Good evening, ma'am. This is Nitin Chaturvedi, National Sales Manager for MSN Lab. Just 1 minute to close this session, ma'am. I would like to have one slide only. Looking forward for your exclusive patronage for world-class international quality brands like Favilode, Tofadose, and Pulmofib, which we have got for entire COVID therapy, ma'am. Just to share with you that we may be young player, but our drive, enthusiasm are the best is associated with yourself. So I thank all my speakers and madam for taking this illustrative COVID discussion on this particular topic. There was a good insights we have taken for both the topics, that is COVID fibrosis as well as the cytokine storms. Thank you all from my side. Thanks a lot for your kind presence for this particular program.
Thank you.
Nice. Good night. Yeah.